right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our program on researching the lives of enslaved ancestors. I'm Josh Goodman. I'm the staff historian here at the State Archives of Florida here in Tallahassee. And looking at the participant list, we've got kind of a packed house today. So thank you all for being with us this morning for this very important and interesting topic. Since we do have some folks that I don't think we have seen before, I thought I'd just start off with a little quick introduction of sort of what we do here at the archives and where we're located and that kind of thing. Many of the resources that we'll talk about today are available to you online. You don't actually have to come into the archives to look at them. But there are a couple that you may want to come into the archives to use. So I'll go ahead and give some quick information about this. We, along with the State Library, are located in the R.A. Gray Building in Tallahassee. Here's our address. We are open just like any public library, Monday through Friday, except for state holidays, from 9 to 4:30. You do not have to have an appointment, and we do offer free parking. There is a common misconception that you have to make an appointment or that you have to have some kind of official business to come in and use the archives. Or that you have to have some kind of special training, but that is not correct. The archives are a taxpayer-funded service, and we are glad to have any of you in to do research here in the records that we have available here. So please feel free to make use of those. Also, take a look online at archivesflorida.com. That's got access to all of our databases and a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about today. So please do avail yourself of that. But let's go ahead and jump into today's topic. Oh, by the way, there's a picture of our research facility. So you can see it's nice and friendly and open. We've got computers to use the computer databases with the library's materials. We share a research space with the library, so you can come in and pull their stuff right off the shelf. With the archival materials, you just ask for what you need. We've got a full reference desk staff. They love helping folks solve mysteries, especially genealogical mysteries. So please feel free to come in and make use of that material. But let's go ahead and jump in into today's material. So genealogy is coming back big time as a pastime with things like Finding Your Roots, the show, 23andMe, Ancestry, Family Search, all these wonderful websites and resources that are coming out. People have really been taking on genealogy in a whole new way. And it has been it's been very rewarding for those of us here at the archives to help facilitate that research and that interest in helping people trace their family roots. But it can be very difficult to trace your family roots if you have individuals in your family tree who were enslaved at some point. Not only do you have the usual problems that genealogists of any sort face, things like names being spelled differently or courthouse records going missing or being destroyed in a fire or something like that. People using nicknames instead of their real names on documents. And how many of us have had to face the trouble of ancestors always wanting to go by their initials? So you can, and then what do you do if you've got 3 W.R. Smiths in the same town? How do you know which one you're looking at? So if you have individuals in your family tree who at some point in their lives were enslaved, or if they were enslaved for all of their lives, not only do you have those same problems applying, but you also have the problem that, prior to 1865, the vast majority of African Americans in the South are considered property and not people. And so they are documented as property and not people. And what that means is that many of the resources that individuals use to look up their white ancestors in that time period or non-enslaved ancestors, those resources just aren't available for those enslaved ancestors. And so it creates a whole new set of challenges. However, there is some hope, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Because while slaves were not necessarily documented the same way as white individuals, there are a few occasions where they are documented as individuals in civil records. And then there are a few cases, there are many cases, where even though an enslaved person might not be treated as an individual human being in records, we can take advantage of the fact that property owners, slave owners, actually treated slaves as property, and it was one of the most valuable forms of property that these individuals owned. And so they tended to document their ownership of slavery very, very well, especially when it came time to think about their passing slaves down to their children, or selling them to another individual or something like that. And we can take advantage of that meticulous documentation to help us bring some humanity back into this, and to sort of take these enslaved individuals and bring back their humanity, and to reinsert them into family trees, so that we can have them as part of our families in that way. So that's what we want to look at today, is how can we take advantage of all these different forms of documentation, whether they're being documented as individuals or as property, and help build out family trees that include these individuals, which is the ultimate way, I think, of sort of reasserting their humanity in this picture. So, just a quick overview of what we'll cover today. We'll start out with some tips and strategies for getting started. Some of you, I see in the list here, I think there's some of you who've probably been doing this for quite some time. So some of this may be old hat, but I hope that you enjoy the review, and maybe there'll be some ideas that pop out at you that are new. And then we'll go through, the bulk of what we'll do today will be to just look at some different kinds of useful records and where you can find them. Again, the vast majority of them are actually already available online. Some of them are the kinds of things you'll have to go to individual courthouses or pay us a visit here at the State Archives. And of course, we do hope you come in so that we can help you with those. But then we'll also look at an example case just to take a couple of steps through and kind of think about the logic of how you want to go through using these different documents and how they work together. So let's go ahead and look at getting started. So let's say that you're at the very beginning of tracing your family tree, and you know that you're going to be encountering some ancestors who are enslaved. And so you're sort of preparing yourself, steeling yourself for these difficulties. How can you best position yourself to set yourself up for success? Well, the process of getting started for you, if you're working with a family tree that's going to include enslaved ancestors, starts very much the same as it would for anybody else. And these are recommendations that we would give anyone who is starting out at the beginning of their family tree. Start with what you know. You already have a great deal of information at your disposal just from what you know about yourself, your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, what you know about where the family has moved from at different times. Start with that, because every piece of data that you can write down definitively at the beginning, it's going to make the task seem less overwhelming. That is a key thing for new genealogists who are just coming into the fold, or even if you've been doing genealogy for a while, this is always a good reminder. Building out a family tree can be overwhelming because you've got, you get to a point where you have so many question marks. But if you'll just start by writing everything down that you do know and getting it organized into a form where you can kind of just focus on the parts that aren't done and leave the, and just sort of take these challenges one at a time, that's going to be so helpful. So gather information from living relatives. You never know what cousins know. You never know what they might have been told when they were younger, when older relatives were alive. You never know what parents might recall that they just didn't share with you because they didn't think that you would want to know or that you needed to know or whatever. Do some interviews with folks who are alive, the oldest ones that you can find. And even if there are some relatives who seem to be a little confused about the details, that's okay. If you've got some relatives who say, well, I don't really know for sure, I remember somebody said something about X, Y, or Z, still take note of those things, because even if the breadcrumb trails that they're laying down for you are not 100% accurate, they may at least give you, if not the right name of a person, the right location. Or if not the right location, maybe the right name or the right age group or something like that. So take notes on everything that you get from these folks. And most important of all, and I've got an example on the next slide here, do start keeping a great big pedigree chart. So that this is a way to kind of organize what you're doing, and most importantly, it keeps things from being overwhelming because you can actually picture what data you have and what data you do not have. We do have a webinar on getting started in genealogy. It's in our YouTube channel, and you can find a link to it there for the Bureau of Library Development, Florida Department of State. We have a webinar on getting started in genealogy. So this is an example of a basic pedigree chart. Again, start with yourself, because so much of the information that you have is going to be related to the generations just back from yourself. But you can see that by doing this, we can very quickly kind of see where the places are that we need to do more work. And so this is going to help you focus your research time so that you don't spend a lot of time working in places where it's not going to give you as many answers that you don't already have. Okay, now something to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, as I say, a lot of the steps that you'll take at the beginning of the research process are going to be the same as they would be for anybody. But as you get farther and farther back and you get closer to the moment of emancipation and closer to the era of slavery, there are some realities to keep in mind. First of all, former slaves oftentimes change their names after emancipation. Okay, a lot of them had been on plantations for their entire lives, had been assigned names, and in some cases assigned to families that were not theirs, and they knew that they were not theirs. They didn't have any choice in the matter, and so as soon as they were off those plantations and on their own, tended to cast off anything to do with those plantations. And another thing, Southern slave owners had a tendency to name their slaves, to give them these Greco-Roman names, because Southerners like to imagine themselves as this New Age Greco-Roman paradise in the South. So they tended to give these Greco-Roman names to their slaves, things like Scipio and Agrippa and stuff like this. And recently freed African-American slaves knew that these names were not really in step with what white people were named at that time. And so they had a tendency to get rid of those names. You will see some of them in the census and in some of the records that we're going to look at today, but in many cases they take those Greco-Roman names and they ditch those in favor of more anglicized names, things like James and Robert and Allen and things like that. So when you go and look through the records, you've got to be prepared for the fact that sometimes you're just going to hit a wall where, James Smith is no longer James Smith when you encounter him in another record. Maybe his mom kept the same name, or maybe his brothers and sisters kept their same names, but all of a sudden they're going to have a brother who's the same age, everything's the same about James except for his name. So just be aware of that. Documentation of ages is not always accurate. Sometimes the plantation owners will admit this in their bills of sale or their mortgages or their estate inventories. They'll say, here's Dicey, who's an African-American slave, who's about 30 years of age, and that's obviously very approximate. Sometimes you're going to run into that. You're just going to have to deal with that. The thing to keep in mind is that if you are hot on the trail of an ancestor and you know the age because of how they show up in Freedmen's Bank records or the 1870 census, which, let's face it, census takers also are not always the best at putting down ages, just because of the way the census is taken. But if you are looking for them in records from the 1860s or the 1850s, and you encounter somebody where the family relationships seem right, the name seems right, but the age is 10 years off, don't necessarily reject that person. It could be that the slave owner just simply did not know the age of that person. Also, former slaves move a lot right after emancipation. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau, which we'll talk about a good bit today, the Freedmen's Bureau did try to get former slaves back onto a plantation as quickly as possible because that was the economy of the South. You can't just have factories magically pop up just because the Civil War is over and lots of people need jobs. Agriculture is still the primary way of making money for everybody in the South. And so former slaves do end up back on plantations, but oftentimes they would take advantage of their freedom and move around a little bit, go someplace different, not be on the same place where they had spent so many years enslaved. And so sometimes they do this several different times. As the sharecropping system goes into effect after the Civil War and then the tenant farming system as well, Sometimes they would have disagreements with landlords, and so they would pick up their families and just move to the next plantation down the road, or maybe they would go, maybe they were able to locate relatives that they had been separated from during the era of slavery, and they were trying to reunite with those people, and sometimes they moved to go and join other folks. And the Freedmen's Bureau helped facilitate that as well, and even in some cases provided transportation. And so you've got to be prepared to look in unexpected places for relatives. So just because they show up in the 1870 census in Florida does not mean that they were in Florida during the course of slavery. There are some folks who stay on the same plantation, but many do not. Okay, so I think we've harped enough on those research realities. So when you're getting started all the way back to 1870, you're going to be able to take advantage of the same kinds of records that everyone else is able to use up back to that point. So federal and state censuses, marriage records, tax rolls, city directories and gazetteers, land patents and deeds in particular. There are a number of freedmen who do manage to earn enough money to purchase land of their own. Many of them, of course, are taking advantage of the sharecropping system or the tenant farming system, but there are some who earn enough money to get property of their own. Things like lists of voters and jurors, business licensure records, get creative. You never know where these individuals are going to pop up. And we've done a number of webinars on how to research business records, how to research land documents and that sort of thing. Again, our YouTube channel for the Bureau of Library Development, that's a great place to go to look at places where we've looked at these documents in detail. There is one kind of record that I want to talk about for just a moment very, very specifically, and that is militia muster rolls. So when we think about military records, we tend to think about records associated with a specific war. So like the Civil War or the Spanish-American War or one of the World Wars or something like that. But remember that the military still has a presence even in peacetime. Nowadays, we would think of that as the National Guard, or active, the smaller number of active service military that we have at any particular time. But there's a pretty strong militia in Florida, even in the 19th century. And there's kind of two kinds. There's the kind that's theoretically in the militia all the time, the enrolled militia, we call them. That's everybody between certain ages. They're just liable for military service at any time in theory. But much more active are the independent militia companies, where a group of guys will get together in a county and they'll write a petition into the governor and say, hey, we're this group of guys. We want to be a militia unit. Please recognize us. And you could do that in the 19th century. And so there are a lot of independent militia companies that we have records for. What's great about this is that if you can find the muster rolls of these independent militia companies, it's a great data point because it puts specific people in a specific place at a specific time, which is the gold standard for doing genealogical research. And we happen to be digitizing a set of these for the 19th century. They'll show up on floridamemory.com. We hope to have them up in the next few months. We're having to go in and index those names individually so that you'll be able to search for them and not just have to browse and look and look and look. We want to have them so that you can search them. So they're not quite up just yet, but look for that in the near future. If you have an ancestor that you're searching for and you would like to request a militia muster roll in the meantime, we can certainly handle that request. You just contact the reference desk at the State Archives. We'll have their contact information at the end of the program here, and those militia muster rolls are available to you. So birth and death certificates, cemetery registers, gravestones, again, all of the normal sources that you would use, they'll work back to 1870. But now let's talk about some of the records that you might find useful that come from the moment of emancipation and right afterwards. Okay, again, this is a moment when there's a lot of change. People are changing their names. People are moving. People are doing all kinds of things. It's a moment of flux. So the best piece of advice that I can give you in this particular space is to try lots and lots of different kinds of records. When you find that ancestor in your family tree, you're able to get them back to 1870. That means that you get names, you get approximate ages, you get family relationships, and you get a geographic data point. Where are they located? Okay, take advantage of all of those data points and look for any documentation in other documents that you can find from the late 1860s, the brief period in between the end of the Civil War and the 1870 census, where you can get at least a few more data points to give you some clues on where you need to look when you get into the period of slavery, because that's when it gets the most difficult. So let's look at where some data points can be. The 1867-68 voter registration rolls, an excellent source of information that we have here for Florida. I'm not sure if they have them for the other, which other southern states have these available. We do have them here in Florida for at least 19 counties. So let me tell you a little bit about what these are. So during the Reconstruction era, right after the Civil War, Andrew Johnson, who was president after President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, he attempted to control the Reconstruction process to begin with, and we call that the presidential Reconstruction era. And he essentially let the former Confederate states back into the United States with more or less easy terms. And so new state governments were established in each of the former Confederate states under presidential Reconstruction. But here's the problem. Congress, which was at that time controlled by what we call the radical Republicans, and that had been Lincoln's party, of course, was the Republicans at that time. The more what was referred to as the radical Republicans did not believe that Andrew Johnson had done enough, had required enough of the former Confederate states to let them back into the Union. And so when the former Confederate states by and large, refused to ratify the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equality before the law for African Americans and all people, then Congress essentially said, all right, we're going to pass what's called the Reconstruction Act. And that's where they essentially declared all of those state governments that had been created after the Civil War and allowed by President Johnson, they declared those invalid and said, okay, you can't get back into the Union until you do this list of things. One of the things that Congress required as a result of the Reconstruction Act was that each former Confederate state had to allow the occupying Union military to register all eligible men 21 years and older to vote. All eligible men, including African Americans. Now, women, of course, can't vote at this time, but what they were saying was that all men 21 years of age and older, including African Americans, regardless of their previous condition of servitude, had to be allowed to vote. And so they did a whole special voter registration drive like none other in 1867 and 68 to get everybody registered to vote who was eligible. And so this is the first time that African Americans en masse are registered to vote here in the state of Florida. And so we have those records from that voter registration drive from 67 and 68. We have them for 19 counties, and they're available on floridamemory.com. So I'm going to show you how you get to those real quick. All right, I'm going to go to, this will work in any browser that you like. I hope that that you guys out there have used floridamemory.com. That's our official digital outreach tool for the State Archives of Florida. We have lots of great information on there. So it's easy to go to floridamemory.com. You don't have to have an account. You don't have to have a password. You don't have to pay for it. This is a taxpayer-funded service. You just go right to it. And then go to the collections page, collections. That's where we keep all of our documentary material. We've got lots of great tools in here. The map collection is wonderful. I could go on, but here we go. Voter registration rolls 1867 and 68. All right, when we get in here, it'll tell you a little bit about what the documents are, how they work, but this is what you need. Okay, if you click on the All Counties tab, you'll see the counties that we have records for. Not all of the records have survived. So like, for example, with Jefferson County, you won't see Jefferson County in here. Those records have not survived. But Leon County has, Levy, Liberty, Santa Rosa, a lot of counties around the state. So we also give you the opportunity to screen your search results by race. We use the terms black or colored because that's the way they appear in the records. All right, so if, for example, I had an ancestor from Sumter County, notice the P, they still had the P in there in this time. And let's say that I had an African-American ancestor named something Jones, and I wanted to see if he was there for Sumter County. Okay, I can type in Jones, I can put in Sumter County there, and look there, I get a few Joneses. Look at that. Now you'll notice that I didn't put in the first name of my ancestor, and the reason for that is that if you look here at Jesse, look how they spelled Jesse. Okay, there are so many names out there where you just don't know how they might have spelled something. Jesse can be spelled probably 5 different ways: Jessy, Jesse, Jessie. You never know how somebody's going to spell a given name. So my advice is to put as little information as possible into these, and then just be willing to comb through the results. All right, so I really recommend just doing the last name first for this. And because of that, see, if I had put in, let's say that Jesse Jones spelled his nameJessie, let's see what happens if I put in Jesse Jones for Sumter County. Like this. Look at that. I don't get anything. See, so that's why you want to stick to just as little information as you can and be willing to go through the longer results list. Something else about this collection, remember, people are moving around a lot. So if you know that Jesse Jones, if that's the person you're looking for, if you know that he eventually ends up in Sumter County, I wouldn't just look in Sumter County. I would also look at the surrounding counties. For example, Marion County is nearby. Alachua County is nearby. It's not in here, but maybe we might look at Hillsborough if it's available. It's not available, but Hernando is, and that's next door to Sumter County. Just be willing to kind of jump around a little bit. You're not always going to get what you want on the first try. Think creatively. So let's jump back into our PowerPoint. So there's the 67-68 voter registration rolls. Next thing, one of my favorite records. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau, they came into the picture pretty quickly after emancipation, and attempted to do all kinds of tasks to integrate the freedmen into society as quickly as possible, and most importantly, get the Southern economy back moving with freedmen involved and working, just not as slaves. And now we know that the system that took its place, sharecropping, and then a little later the tenant farming system, we know that there were a lot of problems with those systems, but the Freedmen's Bureau, they did what they could in that moment in a particularly bad situation, and were able to do a lot of things for freedmen, and thankfully they documented a lot of their activities because there was government funding involved. If there's one kind of record that the government is going to keep forever and ever and ever, amen, it's when they owe you money or you owe them money or money is being spent. So because of that, we have lots of records that we can draw on, including the Freedmen's Bank records. These are some of the most detailed of the Freedmen's Bureau records that you can have, and you can see why. Take a look at this. We have a record here for Boone. It's either Boone, yeah, it's going to be Boone Cooper. All right, this guy named Boone Cooper. Look at the kinds of information that we get. What this is he was applying for a savings account with the Freedmen's Bank. And this happens, I happen to know this is the branch from Tallahassee. All right, look at the information we get. We get the date that he was setting up this account. We have the name of his master. This is excellent because once we know the name of a former slave's master, we know whose property records we need to look for, that we need to look in. We know the name of the family. You know, even if it's not Jesse Robeson that we're looking in, we know that there's going to be some Robesons somewhere who have purchased this guy, Boone Cooper. We know that we're going to be able to look in the Robeson family records in Leon County or wherever he happens to live to get some good information. All right, we get the plantation here, 5 miles from Tallahassee. Sometimes you're going to get lucky and the name of the plantation is going to be in here. In this case, maybe Jesse Robeson just didn't have that big of a plantation and it just didn't have a name. Look at this, father or mother, married. We get some information in here about, let's see, Mary Brown, wife's name, Mary Brown. Name of children by former wife. Now this could mean a couple of things. This could mean that Mary Brown is deceased. It could mean that he and Mary Brown were separated at some point. It could mean that they were divorced. Although slave marriages typically aren't recognized by civil authorities in Florida, you know, there could still be, you know, sort of a divorce in just the nature of the thing, and they could be separated in some way. Look here, though. We get the names of children. We've got Ephraim, Emma, Sylvia, Alec. And what's wonderful about this is that this means that we can match up this record with the 1870 census. If we find Now, of course, this guy's 62 years old right now. If we look down here, see where it says age 62 as of October 1866. That means the kids probably are not living at home anymore. They might be. We might look in the 1870s. If we're trying to match this record up with an 1870 census record, we might look for a guy named Boone Cooper with, maybe Mary still in the picture, maybe someone named Ephraim, Emma, Sylvia, Alec. Those are pretty distinctive names. If we find somebody named Boone Cooper with somebody by these names living in that household, we can feel pretty good, especially if the ages match up. We can feel pretty good about that being a match. Place of birth, Hartford County, North Carolina. So we know that Boone Cooper was sold at some point from North Carolina down here, or maybe the Robesons moved here from North Carolina. Those are things that we can investigate. We can see that Boone is currently living in Tallahassee, Florida as of 1866, and that his occupation is that he's a well digger. That may also help us if there's some records in Tallahassee. Maybe we can find where he's been put on some particular contract or something. We might be able to use that information. So these are great. How do you find them? Okay. FamilySearch.org, which is run by the LDS Church out of Salt Lake City, they have a wonderful, wonderful database of records that is growing every day. They have a gigantic group of volunteers who is constantly indexing these microfilmed records from the National Archives, and so they do a wonderful job. Now, having said that, I do want to point out that FamilySearch.org is always a work in progress, and sometimes it can be a little difficult to navigate. So I want you to take note of what I have here on the slide where I say search Family Search for, specifically, Freedmen Branch Records. I want you to keep those keywords in mind, because just because you type in Freedmen's Bank doesn't mean you're going to get exactly what you want when you get onto FamilySearch.org, and I'm going to demonstrate that for you. Okay, let's go over to Family Search. Here we are, FamilySearch.org. You'll note that I'm signed in with an account. It is free to create an account, so definitely take advantage of that. All right, here we go. Let's go. If we go under Search, now you can do a top-level search if you want to. You can just come here and search first name and last name. But, if you're searching for a guy named, Jim Jones or Aggie Smith or something like that, it's going to take you a while to weed through all of the Aggie Smiths all over the planet. So my recommendation is to drill down a little bit into an individual set of records and then do your search there, if it can be done. So what you do is you go to the search menu here and you go to Catalog. Now, I want to show you a couple of things here. Searching by place. That's one way you can do it, but if you want to get to a specific kind of record really fast, choose titles instead. And then I want to show you why it's so important to use those keywords. If I type in Freedmen Bank, those are pretty simple keywords, right? On Google, this would give me exactly what I was looking for. Freedmen, Philanthropy, and Fraud, a history of the Freedmen Savings Bank. That's not what I needed. So let me change up my search terms and see if maybe it's Freedmen's Bank, something like that. Freedmen's Bank Records, okay, but what's this? Okay, you've got all kinds of things, but what are all of these things? Okay, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not always exactly clear where you're going to get what you want. If you type in Freedmen Branch Records, you'll get right to exactly what you want, because the bank records are actually referred to as bank branch records in this. And again, Family Search, they're just using the titles that are on these microfilm publications from NARA. So they're doing fantastic work. It just takes a little bit of navigation, a little bit of experience to kind of navigate some of this stuff. So here we go. You're going to get to a catalog record. It's going to tell you a little bit about the records, what exactly you're getting. It's going to tell you that they're available online, so click here. All right. Now, once you get to this point, you will get a search box. So if you're looking for the Aggie Smiths of the world, or the Jim Jones or whatever, you're going to have an opportunity to search right here. Let me say again, just because you don't get the results that you're searching for on the first try, don't stop there, because they're always doing, they've got hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of volunteers at least who are working on these projects. They're indexing more and more every day, but they don't necessarily have 100% of everything indexed. And just because they have an index doesn't mean that it's 100% correct, just as you've probably seen with Ancestry and other things. So what I would recommend is that if you don't get what you're searching for on the first try, try browsing. Okay? And another reason for that is that if you're running a search, you're not going to get the opportunity to drill down into these specific things. You'll see that the only branch that they have for Florida is going to be right here in Tallahassee. And you'll see all those other records that they have. So now we get to look at this specific roll of records. All right, here we go. Page in, page out. We get these savings account records. Now you'll notice that they are not in alphabetical order. They are put in the order of people actually applying for the savings accounts. Okay, so you're going to want to take advantage of that search as much as you can. But again, if you don't find who you're looking for, come in here and take the time to do the browsing. It might take you a while, but who knows? You might discover some good folks along the way who are connected to your family tree. You just didn't know. It's definitely a good idea to just come in. And the other thing to remember is that not every freedman actually got a savings account. Many of them did not. So keep that in mind. But Freedmen's Bank Records, excellent stuff. All right, let's go on to the next thing. Ration Records. Again, one of the first things that the Freedmen's Bureau tried to do is to take the former slaves who had just come off of plantations where they had spent, in many cases, their entire lives enslaved, and they tried to get them back onto plantations, but as wage workers, not as slaves. So how do you do that? Well, nobody has any cash in the South at this point. Even before the Civil War, the South was extremely cash poor. That's why you see so many cases, when you go back and look in deed books and mortgage books and the records of the clerks of courts in all the different courthouses, some of the thickest books in there are mortgage books, because practically the entire agricultural South is running on credit. People are borrowing against their land. People are borrowing against their slaves. They're borrowing against the next crop of corn, the next crop of cotton. It's insane. So nothing's really changed after the war. None of these plantation owners have cash to pay their former slaves who are now working as wage earners on their plantations. What they do have is shares of crops. They do have the ability to say, all right, if you work for me, you're going to get a certain amount of the vegetables and the corn and the cotton that you grow. That's what I can give you. And so the Freedmen's Bureau tried to facilitate that system. And one of the things that they did to kind of make it easier was they offered rations. They would give out food and certain kinds of supplies. Now, one of the qualifications that they set for that was they said, okay, we'll give you rations for you and your family, but you've got to be on a plantation working. You've got to have a labor contract concluded in some way, unless you have some kind of disability or something like that. And so the paperwork side of that we can take advantage of is the certificate that a freedman would have to turn in to show that they had gotten one of these labor contracts concluded. What we're looking at here on the screen is an example of a certification by a landowner saying, hey, I, James Oliver, a landowner, I have rented to this guy, Stephen Allen, who's a freedman. I've given him this many acres of land. He's promised to work it for the above specified period. Here's where it's located. This is the name of the place. Here's a description. Oh, and by the way, here's Stephen and all of his family. This is absolutely invaluable because look at the year. This is 1866 is when this is, actually, no, this one's 1868. My bad. But this is a couple of years before the census of 1870. Remember, people are moving so much in these days. They're changing their names. They're moving around. Any data point you can get prior to 1870 is going to put you in a better and better position to find what you need to find when you have to switch over to looking at property records prior to emancipation. So look what we get here. The same kind of family relationships that you get in the 1870 census. We get Stephen. We get somebody who we can presume is probably his wife, Caroline. And we've got, look at here, we've got the kids. Phoebe, Linda, Thera, Jasper, Florina maybe, and so on. And so this is just a wonderful kind of record that you can use. Let's look at how to get it. Family Search has these. Again, it's a little bit of a web to try and find where they have these, so just take my word for it. Use Assistant Commissioner Florida, and it's going to get you to what you need. Let's take a look at the advantage. Let's go out to Family Search, just like I started over brand new. Okay, Assistant Commissioner Florida is what we need. So let's go to Catalog. We're looking for a title, not a place. And let's go Assistant, let's see if I can type. Assistant Commissioner Florida. Look at there. Records of the Assistant Commissioner and Subordinate Field Offices for the State of Florida, Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. That's the long form name for the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? We get a catalog record. It's going to tell us a little bit about the records and what's there. If we click on here, now this one you'll see does not have a search box. Bummer, right? It does not have a search box. And what that typically means with Family Search is that it has not been indexed enough to the point where they've been able to go in and create a logical search algorithm or whatever they have to do to make it searchable. But that is okay, because they'll still give you access to the images even before they're fully indexed. So what we do is we browse through these images. And there's a bunch of them. Okay, now they've got it organized by state, so choose whichever state you're looking at. We're going to use a Florida example, and then wow, there's all this stuff. Now, we're not talking about every single kind of record here because all these are all different kinds of records. A lot of them are just correspondence between the leaders of the Freedmen's Bureau in Florida, and they're not going to be that useful for genealogical research. Occasionally, they'll discuss specific cases, but it's really a needle in a haystack there. What you're going to find most useful, and what we were looking at on the other screen, is these applications of freedmen for rations. Oh, and by the way, they do have a register down here. This is the paperwork that happens after those rations have been issued. But what's going to give you that nice family relationship, mom, dad, and the kids, is going to be these applications of freedmen for rations, 1868. Oh, and one more thing. The reason why they are, let me get back into them here. The reason why there's two different ones, I don't know exactly why they did it this way, but see how it says page to young? They're in alphabetical order. They're filed in alphabetical order. So this is everything up through the end of O, and then this is P through Y. There appear not to be any Z's. Okay, so if I go into these, all right, this is all I get. There's no indexes available. They haven't indexed these yet, but thankfully they are in alphabetical order. That's probably why it's low priority for them to index them. You know, the savings account one, that's because those are not in alphabetical order. That probably explains why they did those first. All right, but as we go through, you can see they put the A's first, and then each of these has those wonderful family relationships. Look at this. All right, I, Tony Chandler, I've rented to Matthew Adams, 10 acres. It's located on the old Allen Place, Robert Ponder's plantation on Jackson Bluff Road. Look at all this great information that you're getting. Okay? And we get all these people who are living with Matthew Adams. And look, there's some folks who don't have his same last name. So this is going to help you think about family relationships that may be continued from the time that these people were living together in slavery. All of this information is going to be useful when you get back to the point where you have to switch to property records. Okay, so Freedmen's Ration Records. Let's jump back into the PowerPoint. Okay, last but not least, Freedmen's Bureau Marriages. So right after the end of the Civil War, Florida was placed under martial law. It was occupied by the Union Army for a period of time. And during that time, civil authorities were restored fairly quickly, but there was a time period, actually a couple of time periods, and it was a little bit uneven how they came out of this, where civil government was not valid, so to speak, in the state. The authority was the Union military. And during that time period, there were a lot of slaves who, or former slaves rather, freedmen at that point, who wanted to get married. And so since the civil authorities were powerless at that point to make any marriage licenses out, rather they had to turn to individuals in the Freedmen's Bureau and in the occupying Union military. And you can get to those marriages through Family Search. The format that those marriage certificates takes is pretty much the same. It looks like any other marriage certificate. It just happens to be coming from a military guy instead of from the clerk of the circuit court. So where you find these, Freedmen Marriage is going to get it for you. Let's just jump into our search here. So if we go to Family Search, again, search, catalog, we're looking for a title, and I said we're looking for a title. There it is. Freedmen Marriage. Okay. Now look, there's several different ones in here. Make sure you're clicking on the right ones. All of these are located, all of these have to do with specific places. We want this one here at the bottom. United States Freedmen's Bureau Marriages 61 to 72. Nice catalog record with some information. All right, it's available here. Look at there. They give you a nice search. So you're going to be able to search for the last name you're looking for. Again, same rules apply that we were talking about with our buddy Jesse Jones in Sumter County back with the 1867-68 voter registration rolls. Names can be spelled differently. Remember that you're working with a population of folks who had been forbidden in many cases to learn to read and write. They're spelling, you know, they're not telling someone how to spell their names. They're just saying what their name is, and these clerks are writing it down, sometimes phonetically, sometimes how their buddy who has the same last name is spelled. You don't necessarily know how these names are being spelled, so beware of that. I'm just going to try Jones here just to see what we get, and so we can do that. Now that's going to turn back, obviously, a lot of Jones. Some of these folks aren't even named Jones here. This probably means that Jane Mead was marrying some guy named Jones. But let's back up one step, because I'm going to back up one step. Okay, because what we can do, if we go into browse the images, I think that we can, yeah, there we go. We can actually get down just into the Florida marriages, and that's going to help us. Ooh, look at this. Look, look, look. They have split this up into surnames. And so you're going to actually get a chance to look, and you can find the surnames that you're going after right there. Isn't that handy? Yes. Okay. Freedmen's Marriage Records. That's how you get into those. All right. Back into the PowerPoint we go. Oops. What have I done? I've done something. Okay. All right. All right. So those are my top picks for records to use in the era of emancipation. We look to be doing good on time. Off we go into documents that you use into the era of slavery. Okay, so once you've gone back as far as you can go, back to 1865 when slavery is still in effect, you got to kind of change your mindset a little bit, because the records that you locate prior to 1865 are not going to be organized so much according to the name of your ancestor, but rather they're going to be organized according to the names of the people who owned them or claimed to own them, in a sense. So how do you know who to look for? How do you know which slave owners to look for? It's a little bit of a needle in a haystack, but there are some clues. First of all, some records, like that Freedman's Bank record that we look at, are just going to tell you straight out. Remember, our buddy Boone Cooper, he just said on his bank application, I was owned by a guy named Robeson. So if you were going to try and look up Boone Cooper's owners and try to trace Boone back into the era of slavery, you would start looking through property records belonging to a guy named Robeson in Leon County, and not just the Robeson named on the bank records that we looked at. You would look at any Robeson in Leon County, or even in the neighboring counties, to see if you could find evidence of that guy Boone Cooper and his wife and his kids. But in many cases, you're not going to have that bank record. You're not going to have that smoking gun. So another possibility is that a freedman chose the last name of his or her former owner. Most slaves prior to emancipation did not have a last name of any sort, because slave owners had a tendency, and this is part of the way that they sort of separated the humanity of these individuals away from the business side of owning them as chattel, is they in many ways did not treat enslaved individuals as having families. Some did, but many did not. And so when they're referred to in documents, they tend not to have family names. And so enslaved individuals emerge from slavery not having that civil tie to families because they're not recorded in civil records in many cases. And so that they've never had a reason to have a last name. Some of them intrinsically knew what they wanted their last name to be, and so they just took that last name. Some of them just picked one that they liked. And then some of them chose to have the last name of their owners, particularly if they continued to have a relationship with that owner for a while, either as a sharecropper or as a house servant or something after emancipation. Okay, so if you're not able to find a smoking gun record like a Freedman's Bank record, I would recommend looking for individuals with the same last name. So if you've got an ancestor named Henrietta Jernigan in the 1870 census, Henrietta Jernigan, and they lived in Jackson County, I would start looking for other Jernigans in Jackson County, Gadsden County, Liberty County, in that area to see if any female slaves named Henrietta are on those plantations, or if any slaves named Henrietta were either sold or mortgaged in those counties, or even maybe up north in Alabama or Georgia a little bit. Okay, if that doesn't work, if you're not able to find if you're not able to find an individual like that, keep in mind that these folks may have moved a little bit. So you may be looking for Henrietta Jernigans. You may be looking for Jernigan plantations in the Carolinas or in Tennessee or something like that, because again, these folks are trying to reunite themselves with family that they were brutally separated from during the course of slavery. So they can move quite a bit. But if that doesn't work and the name just isn't pinging, you might try looking for individuals in the same area. Look for slaveholders who have slaves who have about the same slaves of about the same ages. So, for example, if I were to look in one of those ration records like this, and we've got a Stephen, a Caroline, a Phoebe, a Linda, all these things, and you can see these ages that I have here. And let's say that I can't find any plantations owned by people named Allen, where Stephen and Caroline and Phoebe and all these people are. And I can't find a Freedman's Bank record for Stephen Allen. But what if I did find somebody in the same area as where this guy is? He's in Leon County. What if I found somebody, maybe the Bradfords, or I found or just somebody who has slaves with these same names, and they seem to be next to each other in estate inventories, almost as though the slave owner, when he was writing down the list of slaves, he thought of them together because they hung out together, because they were, at least as far as they considered it themselves, a family. That may be a clue that can help you make the jump into property records. So these are just some tips and tricks. It is a little bit of a needle in a haystack, but those strategies are going to help you locate many of these families when you start looking for them in property records instead of in civil records and things that we've looked at so far. So let's look at the kinds of property records where you may find enslaved individuals. Wills are one of the best. They're the most frequently recorded because, again, property is very, very important to individuals, and slaves are very, very valuable property to slave owners. It's in many cases the most valuable thing that they have. And so they tend to document that property very, very meticulously. Okay, so this, for example, this is a will from a woman named Elizabeth Powell from Franklin County down in the Apalachicola area. And she's making out her will here, and she says, I will and bequeath unto Isabel, my granddaughter, and wife of Mr. Lewis here, and the child so-and-so, the following property to wit. One Negro boy by the name of Washington, a mulatto. So see, we're already getting some great information about the age of 14 years. This is something that we can cross-reference against Freedmen's Bureau records. We can cross-reference it against the 1870 census. Okay. And look at what else we get. Purchased by me in the city of New Orleans, 5th day of August, 1847, from Lewis E. Smith of Mobile, Alabama, or something like Mobile, Alabama. Mobile, Alabama. See, this will is already, they're trying to establish a chain of title here, just like you would with a piece of land. It's a little disturbing sometimes to read through this, but this is the reality of it, and we can use it to our advantage here. we're getting all this information about Washington. So if you happen to be looking for somebody named Washington Burke or Washington Jones or Washington whoever, and you know that they were somewhere in Franklin County at the time of emancipation, you may be able to cross-reference the age, you might be able to cross-reference some other information to determine that this is the guy you're looking for. Ooh, imagine if it was a Washington Powell. That would be quite the smoking gun, wouldn't it? Okay, and then look at this. With just this one document, you're going to be able to trace him all the way back to New Orleans, to Alabama, and that's going to help you get on to the next stage of your search. So where do you find wills? Wills are typically kept in the county courthouses where the will is going to be executed. Now, that's not necessarily the only place a will be kept. Wills oftentimes are also recorded in the counties where the heirs live. If they don't live in the same county as the person who's going to die and leave them all this stuff, oftentimes the will get recorded in a couple of different places. So, if you don't find a will in the county courthouse that you're looking for, try the surrounding counties. People move. White people are moving around at the end of the Civil War just like African Americans, so that's something to keep in mind. County courthouses. Now, here at the State Archives, we have microfilm copies of many of the will books, thanks to the LDS Church. You can also get a number of these on Ancestry.com and Family Search. However you prefer to look in. Sometimes it's nice to come into the State Archives because our reference desk archivists, they've used a lot of these materials before. They can kind of be a human being you can talk to sort of help you navigate these records and understand how they work. We are, of course, very glad to do that and to show you what we have. And then maybe you get started with us, but then you move on to other places. We can also take questions over the phone about how these documents work as well. Estate inventories. These are one of my favorites because they tend to be the most detailed. They can be really good. So anytime that a person dies and their estate has to be divided for some reason, that division takes place in what's called a probate court. And most counties have a probate court judge, or sometimes the county judge acts as the probate court judge. Just depends on how things are set up. So a probate court, they deal with distributing property when somebody either dies, is declared insane, or they're too young because they're a minor to manage their own property. And any time that has to be done, usually what the court does is they appoint an administrator, and they tell that administrator, go out and get an inventory of all of the property that this person owns so that I can figure out what to do with it. And then those estate inventories, sometimes they get roped in with all of your other probate records, and then sometimes they're in a book all by themselves. Here in Leon County, we're pretty lucky. All the estate inventories for that still survive for the era of slavery are pretty much located in this one great big book that we have here at the State Archives in the original. We also have a microfilm version of it, and I believe that this microfilm version is available on Ancestry and Family Search as well. And so you can see now they've got everything in here, pots and pans and bedsteads and horses and mules and all kinds of things, but again, most valuable property that they have is land and slaves, these slave owners. So here we get a list of all the individuals that belong to this person, William Davis. And look, they list the ages. Why do they list the ages? Because the age of a slave and the sex of a slave affected their value. Look at this. We've got a woman here who is 55 years old. She's past childbearing years, $50. But then you take a much younger woman, Martha, who's likely to have many more children during the course of her lifetime. She's worth $1,000. Okay? So these records are very valuable because they get you right to what you're looking for. Oftentimes, family relationships are preserved. Now, in this case, the inventory is listed by the age and sex. So they've mixed up all the families. These individuals, they're putting all the ladies, and then they're going through all the men. Now, there are other cases where you get a very different kind of inventory. Look here. They've actually listed out all of the different slaves on this plantation by family. William, Abram, who's a child of Rachel, who we can assume is up here cropped off screen. Matthias, Maddie, wife of Matthias. Let's see. We've got a daughter of Maddie. Hester, daughter of Maddie. Anthony, son of Maddie. See, these relationships, we can compare this up against the 1870 census, against records that we get from the Freedmen's Bureau, and we can use this to definitely make the jump from when these individuals are being treated as individual human beings in the records after emancipation, we can now make the jump to get that family relationship back into the period where they're treated as property in these records. Where do you get estate inventories? Oops. Sorry. Estate inventories, just like our wills, they're going to be stored in probate records. Sometimes, again, they'll be in their own list. For example, you can see in my citation here at the bottom that we've got these in a series all by themselves here at the State Archives. Sometimes they're going to be included with the probate court records in the State Archives. And just to give you an idea of what we have here, I'm going to show you how you can tell real quick what we have. Let's see, archivescatalog.info.florida.gov. I'm going to show you real quick how to see what we have at the State Archives, provided that the Archives Online Catalog is working. If not, you'll just have to take my word for it on this. Okay, here we go. It's gonna play ball with us today. All right, so go to the Advanced Search. And this is going to be a little weird, so just take my word for it that this is how it works. All right, for keyword, put in the name of the county that you want. I'm going to do Jefferson. Since I didn't have any 67, 68 voter registration rolls to give you for Jefferson County, we're gonna do this for the other kind. So Jefferson County, keyword, and put in, for call number, just put L. Just L, nothing else. Click search. The reason I did that is because all local series of local government records in our collection start with L. And so by doing that, it's going to weed out anything that has to do with Jefferson County that is not one of these local series. All right, and look what we're getting. We get will books. Now, some of these are for Leon County. What that means is that the words Jefferson County is in that catalog record somewhere. But you're going to get a bunch of stuff for Jefferson County here. Look, we've got Superior Court case files. We've got school board records. We've got Superior Court minutes, delayed birth certificates, deeds, marriage records, probate records. Look at there, 1838 to 1946. So that means that if for some reason, now of course Jefferson County is right next door to us, so if you can make it to Tallahassee, you can make it to Jefferson County. But if you've got maybe several counties to look through, come and see us at the State Archives. You can get the probate records on microfilm for Jefferson County here, as well as lots of other counties. So that's a way to save some time. All right, let's jump back into the PowerPoint. Okay, moving on to the next thing. Deeds and mortgages. I have these roped together because oftentimes they look the same, except for a little piece at the end. So here's what I mean. So with slaves being such valuable property to slave owners, anytime that a slave would be sold, there was generally some kind of bill of sale attached to that. And it is true that the bill of sale, the receipt, whatever you want to call it, would have been retained kind of like you would retain a car title by the slave owner himself or herself. However, because it was so important, just like ownership of land, title to land was so important, many individuals would actually record slave bills of sale with the county clerk. Use that to your advantage. Where these typically show up is in the deed books, almost like the slave was a piece of land, because that's the way that clerks of court would record deeds to property, is in deed books. So that's right. Deed books don't just have deeds to land. Once you get prior to emancipation, they actually have deeds to human chattel property as well. What we're looking at here, for example, let's see if I've got this blown up on the next page. Oh, good. All right. Know all men by these presents that I, John A. Pringle of the county of Escambia, state of Florida, so-and-so and so, in consideration for the sum of $440 to me in hand paid by so-and-so Caldwell, the receipt of which I acknowledge, I do hereby sell and convey to the said Caldwell the following described Negro slaves. All right, so a woman named Sally, about 30 years of age. Again, remember, these guys don't always know the ages of their slaves. Sometimes these slaves have been bought and sold several times, and they just don't know the ages. Sometimes the slaves themselves don't know their ages as well. Let's see, and a Negro boy named, let's see, call him this, named John, son of said Sally. So see, sometimes you can even get family relationships in here. And again, this is something that you can cross-reference with Freedmen's Bank records, with 1870 census records to help make that jump back to property records. So this is essentially what a deed looks like, is he's saying, all right, this amount of money, this is what's being sold, I hereby relinquish my title and I sell it to this other guy. And he records this with the county clerk because he wants to make sure that everybody knows it, that there's no question about the change in title. And the buyer wants to know this, wants to put this on record as well, because he doesn't want anybody accusing him of not actually owning this slave. Also, if he's ever going to borrow money against this slave, the bank is probably going to want to know this, or whoever holds the mortgage note on that slave is going to want to know for sure that there's clear title to this slave. All right? But here's a catch. Oftentimes these deeds, oftentimes these guys don't just sell their slaves, but they also mortgage them. Because they are some of the most valuable property that these slave owners own, in many cases, when these guys need capital to make an addition on their house or to buy new equipment for the plantation or something like that, oftentimes they will actually mortgage these slaves. So this is actually the second half of that deed. Look at this. Now, the condition of these presents, this is that same John Pringle to Caldwell thing. The condition of these presents is that whereas the said Caldwell has this day loaned unto the said Pringle the sum of $440. In other words, Caldwell is the banker in this case, and he has loaned some money to our buddy John Pringle, who owns those two slaves above named. If the said Pringle shall well and truly pay the said sum of $440 when due the 30th day of April, 1850, or whatever that is over there, and for which the said Pringle has given his promissory note. In other words, he's written out a note saying, I promise to pay my buddy Caldwell so-and-so. Then these presents shall be null and void. So be careful when you're, to be honest with you, for the purposes of genealogy, it doesn't matter whether it's a mortgage or a deed. The one thing that I want you to keep in mind is that if your county clerk, if the county that you're doing research in has deeds and mortgages separate, in this case, the deed book, the mortgage is in the deed book, so they're kind of stuck together. But in some counties, mortgages and deeds are in separate books. Look in both, because slaves appear in both books. They appear as property that's being deeded. They also appear as property that's being mortgaged. Both of these tend to be kept in the county courthouse in the county where the deal went down. That's where that is. Ask your local clerk of court. They can be organized differently depending on the county. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they're separate. Okay, mortality schedules. We tend to think of population schedules when we think about the federal census, but they also keep other things like an industrial schedule. They keep a mortality schedule. There's several different kinds. The mortality schedule, what they're doing is they're taking down the names of everybody who had died in the preceding year and what they died of. This is sort of the rudimentary beginnings of public health research for the United States. And the advantage for doing research with enslaved ancestors is that they also put down the names of slaves who had died. Now, here's the problem. Remember that thing about slaves not having last names. Okay? When they write down slave names in the mortality schedules, a lot of times they write down their names and they don't put anything in there about who owned them, which makes them almost useless for genealogists. Now, you may be able to triangulate and say, oh, okay, Leah, 50 years old, that matches up with some other record that I have. That might help. The problem is that you just don't get too many other breadcrumbs here. You do sometimes get lucky with the mortality schedules. Oh, and the other weakness about these, they only include people who died in the year preceding the census. So if you're dealing with an ancestor who did not die in 1849 or 1859, these aren't going to help. All right? You do get lucky sometimes, and look here. This was a particularly thorough census taker who wanted to earn his keep. And so if we look in here at color and we look at some of these black individuals, look, they actually put down a last name. Peggy, 55 years old. Here's the information about her dying. They've put down a last name for her. This is probably the name of her owner. This is fantastic because now you're going to be able to go and look through probate records and estate inventories for the Hart family in Leon County and the surrounding counties, and you might be able to turn up some more information on Peggy that's going to help you make the jump between these records during the era of slavery and the ones after emancipation. Slave schedules. Ironically, these are some of the least useful census records, even though they're called slave schedules. The reason for that is that the slaves are almost never named by name. All of these names that are on this example of a slave schedule from Columbia County in 1860, these are the names of slave owners. The only help that they're going to be to you really is to show you how many slaves the person has. And if you already know that a particular slave owner owns a relative that you're looking for as of 1860, you can look at this to determine whether they actually had that person as of 1860. So if you know that you've got an ancestor who should have belonged to this guy, Robert Chambliss, and she should have been about 25 years old as of 1860, you can use this to determine that she was indeed still living with Robert Chambliss as of 1860. That's about the kind of thing you're going to get. Every now and then they'll make some notations on slave names. Sometimes this was noted later by people, but for the most part, slave schedules are not as useful as they sound. Church records. I mentioned to you that slave marriages, slaves are not recognized as human beings by civil authorities except for court cases. They were more than happy to prosecute slaves for various crimes. So they were willing to consider them human individuals in that case, albeit with pretty unfair court practices. But that's a conversation for another day. But the advantage that we do have is that religious authorities did not necessarily feel the same way. Religious authorities sometimes did record slaves as human beings in their records, the same as everybody else, particularly when marriages and baptisms were performed. Now, for the most part, slave owners slaves oftentimes ministered, they had their own religious figures, leaders among themselves, but sometimes planters who were particularly devout or had some particular reason, they would actually have their local clergy minister to their slaves, either by having clergy members come out to plantations or by having members of their slaves come to the church to be married in the church. That actually happens. It's rare, but it happens. We have here, for example, some records from Trinity Church in Apalachicola, which we have a microfilm copy of those records here. I'm not sure if the original records are still around. I hope they are. But we do have the microfilm records here, as we do for a number of churches. And you can actually see some records in here. Frank and Charlotte, adults. These are individuals who are being baptized in Trinity Church. There's also marriages as well. Let's see. Yes, here I've got an example of some marriages. This is from the St. John's Episcopal Church here in Tallahassee. This is a transcript that was done by the Daughters of the American Revolution. The DAR has done some amazing work in transcribing these records. So you can see in here that we've got a slave marriage here, slaves of James Gamble, Lawrence, and Millie. Those, you just got to look at those, inquire at those individual records. If you can determine who the owner of a particular slave in your family tree is, see if you can figure out what denomination that slave owner was. Look through lists of marriages, look through lists of baptisms in area churches, and once you find their church or their religion, you may be able to use that to see if perhaps a marriage was recorded in there, and who knows what information you might find there. Okay, let's look at one quick example of how to put these sources to work. I think I've already kind of talked a lot about that, so we'll just kind of go through this very quickly. But let's pretend for a moment. I've got a guy here named Agrippa Sutton. Here he is in the 1870 census. He's here with his wife, Satira. They're in their 60s, so they don't have any kids at home. It does look like they've got a couple of other people. William and Alice. These could be kids of Agrippa Sutton. Alice, we've got Hardin, Estelle Hardin, George Mackey, Alice Hardin. Okay, so we've got a couple of different Alices. Some of these could be children or relatives of theirs, but we're looking for Agrippa Sutton and Satira Sutton. Okay, if I have an ancestor in the 1870s that I'm looking for, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look in those 1867-68 voter registration rolls for Agrippa, because he's obviously of the age that he could have voted in 67-68. If he was living in Florida, the Union military would have been going after him, trying to get him to register to vote. Okay, so I'm going to look in those records. I'm going to look in Freedmans Bureau records, in the rations. I'm going to look in marriages. I'm going to look in bank records to see if he might have availed himself of some of those services that the Freedmen's Bank was offering. Oh, and look, he did. There's a bank record here. Okay. Oh, and look what I get right off the bat. His master prior to emancipation was a Dr. Troop Maxwell. And I get some information, Tira, T-I-R-A. Now, it's not satira, but remember, you know, these folks are not necessarily literate. And so they might be, when somebody asks them a question, what's your wife's name? Tira. That's probably what he called her every day. Her full name might have been Satira, but he probably called her Tira as a nickname, a term of endearment. And look, he's got a kid named Alice. So this is a way that I can triangulate and compare this against that 1870 census. And I'm getting some great data points here. I can look at the age, 59 as of 1866. 1870, so 4 years after that. So I'm looking for somebody who's about 63 or so, 63, 64, 68, not that far off. So that's, and I mean, a name like Agrippa Sutton, I mean, that's a pretty good match right there. Okay. But now I've got all of this other information. Once I find the name of this master, Maxwell, I'm going to start looking in the county courthouse for every Maxwell I can find, not just Troop Maxwell, because Troop Maxwell could be the son of Agrippa's owner. He could be the brother of Agrippa's owner. So I'm going to look at every Maxwell I can find. Oh, and by the way, look here. I'm getting Agrippa Sutton having voted here. He registered to vote here August 12th of 1867. Fantastic. What else can I find? Inventory and appraisement of the estate of John J. Maxwell. Again, not Troop, because you never know who's going to be on, who it could be. Because look here, John Maxwell passed away, and so Troop Maxwell, who Agrippa reported as having been his master at the time of emancipation, maybe that was John's son. Okay, you've got to look at every person. Once you get a last name for that owner, look at everybody with that last name in that area. You never know where they're going to pop up. Look who the first people are on the estate inventory. Agrippa, Tira, wife of Agrippa. The ages check out. Rachel, June or Jane, Henry, Alice. Everything's popping up right. Now, obviously, in this case, I chose a name where I was going to be able to, to make some jumps pretty quickly. But this is the kind of logic that you want to follow when you're trying to make these documents hook up and work together. All right, I have jabbered a lot. These are some reference numbers here that you can use. This is the number for the reference desk. If you have any questions about the records that we've talked about, they are glad to tell you what we have. This is the email address. This is a list of some of the databases that we've looked at today. You're also welcome to contact me directly. My email address is joshua.goodman@dos.myflorida.com. And 245-6313 is my direct phone line. You're certainly welcome to contact me if you have any questions about what we've talked about on this webinar. Now I'm going to open up the floor for questions.
Thank you, Josh. This is Melissa. Again, just a reminder, if you've got questions, you can type them into the chat panel, or you can click the hand raise button and we will get you unmuted. So what questions do you guys have for Josh?
While we're waiting to see if any questions are coming in, one thing I neglected to mention about the mortality schedules, you can get the slave schedules on Ancestry.com. The mortality schedules you will find are mysteriously not there. In fact, many of the NARA microfilm publications do not include mortality schedules for Florida for 1850 or 1860. I'm not sure why, but we seem to have the originals to those here at the State Archives. So if you are looking for mortality schedules for a particular county for 1850 or 1860, contact us here at the archives. We'd be glad to scan in a page and send over to you.
Thanks, Patricia. This is a very informative presentation. Thanks. Does anybody have any questions while you're here and you have the opportunity to pick Josh's brain, our resident expert?
Thank you, Connie. Thank you.
Okay, we've got some hands up. Patrick, I'm going to unmute you. And it looks like you've got yourself muted, so you need to unmute yourself by clicking.
Okay, is that it?
Yep.
Yes. Was interested in, is there a source that contains local plantation records for Tallahassee of where we might go to find records from specific plantations?
That is an excellent question, Patrick. The State Archives holds records from a number of plantations here in Tallahassee. Here's the thing. Plantation records are great if you can get them, but there was no requirement that a slave owner had to turn in, to any particular entity, the records of them managing their own plantation. So it's very hit or miss. I would say that maybe 1 out of 50 plantations do we have any sort of record for here. And that's only for the surrounding area. But what you can do is if there's a particular plantation that you're interested in, check with us here at the State Archives. Use the phone number that's up on the screen, or you can search the online catalog, but don't give up. If you don't find what you're looking for in the Archives online catalog, still give us a call, give us an email. Tell us the name of the owner, the plantation owner who you're looking for, and the plantation name, and we'll see if we have any records from that. Again, it's there's a very precious few. The Bradford family, we have some records from them. The Call family, the Brevard family. There's a few key families that we do have plantation records from. Imonia Plantation, but again, it's few and far between. They can be in other places. UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, they collect a lot of records like this, and even though they're up in North Carolina, they do have some records from Florida that might be of some value. The University of Florida Special Collections, you should check with them. Those tend to make their way to archives and libraries, but it's one of those things where you just have to kind of search around. There's no one place where those are going to be located, but we would certainly love to help you get your hands on whichever ones we do have. So give us a call, send us an email, and we'll be glad to help you find it.
Okay, and follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm researching an ancestor who, prior to the end of slavery, rented himself out.
Okay.
And paid a yearly rent. Are there contracts for that? Is there any way to locate who he might have been paying rent to? The person that he was last enslaved to, according to Freedmen's Bureau records, had left the state. So if he's paying rent, I'm wondering, who is he paying rent to? Is there a contract somewhere, or how would that even be arranged?
Was that ancestor living here in Leon County by any chance?
Yes.
It's interesting that you say that. I've run across a couple of cases in probate records where the local clerk of court, and this is somewhat inexplicable. To my knowledge, there's not a legal requirement that had to be managed by the county. I think that there's laws restricting how a slave's time could be rented out. But to my knowledge, the clerk of court didn't have to keep a record of this. But it seems that in some cases there were records kept of slaves' time being hired out here, at least in Leon County. Whether this particular slave would be included in those records, I can't say for sure, but you should definitely contact me after this, because I have encountered those records before. I'll have to go back and find it again to see exactly where that was, but I do believe we have some cases of that information being recorded. However, I should caution everybody who's still with us and listening that practice was not uniform across the state. Oftentimes that hiring out of time was not recorded. That was an agreement between the slave owner and the person who the slave was rented to. But I think we may have some records that might be responsive to that for here in Leon County.
Okay. So
you and I need to get together after this.
Okay, and we do have somebody that wanted to contribute. Rachel Duke says, Florida State Special Collections here. We're currently undergoing a major effort to surface local plantation records in our archives. All are encouraged to get in touch with us.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have somebody with their hand up. Let's see. Juanita, it looks like you can't be unmuted until you enter a PIN. So let's see. I've sent it to you. If you enter that in, or you can type it into chat, whatever your preference is. And while Juanita's working on that, does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, Juanita, go ahead.
I just want to thank Josh for the very informative presentation. I don't really have any questions, but I will be contacting him later for a special project I'm working on. But this is very informative, and so I really thank him for doing this presentation.
Well, I certainly thank you so much for that, and I'm so glad that you could be with us today. And again, you know, so many folks don't realize that the state archives belong to everyone. It's not just for professional historians. It's not just for people who are working on the next book. Everybody contributes to the archives in terms of supporting it through their taxes, by donating the materials that we use to help people answer their research questions all the time. This is a partnership between the state and the public. This is a service that we love to offer. We've got people who work here who are very passionate about helping people solve mysteries, whether they're historical or genealogical. And I think this is one of the most rewarding kinds of mysteries that we can help people solve, is helping people discover their roots, even when the going gets tough. And doing that, we're certainly glad to do it. So please make use of this resource. We're glad to help.
Thank you.
Thanks, Juanita. Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Josh? And we'll stay on for a few minutes more to make sure that we get everything answered that you guys can think of. But we're so glad that all of you could be on today, and thank you so much to Josh for his expertise on this difficult topic. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come through. So like I said, we're going to stand for a couple more minutes, but for those of you that are busy and have things to do, thank you for being on with us, and hopefully you can join us next time. We will be sending out a follow-up message that will have links to the recordings and our YouTube channel with the other genealogy webinars that we've done, and other resources that we deem helpful. So stay tuned for that, and hopefully we'll see you guys online again soon.